I mentioned, we'll ground everything we do in science, but we'll never lose sight of the people that are living with this disease, individuals and their families. And it made me think of a little funny story of my own. First of all, I wish every state in this country had a Joy's House, because we didn't have one in North Carolina when my dad got sick. And the number of times I told Tina, do you want to move? You want a franchise? I remember going to an advocacy, or not an advocacy, well, an advocacy group with my mom, and it was a support group, and they were having a conversation around hygiene. And, you know, specifically how difficult it is as people advance to help them with their hygiene. And, you know, does anybody have any ideas? And my mom raises her hand, and I'm like, huh, this is going to be good. Wonder what she's going to say. And she said, now remember, my mom weighs 120 pounds soaking wet. My dad's probably 220. And she raises her hand. She goes, oh, I figured out how to get my husband to shower. And she goes, I just get in the shower with him. And I look at her, I go, Mom! And she pats my hand, and she's this Southern drawl. She goes, oh, it's okay, honey. I put on my swimsuit. I'm like, Mom, the last thing I'm worried about is you being naked in front of Dad, right? I'm much more worried about the hip fracture that we're about to have. That was what triggered us to get help in the home. And just so that you all know, Mom made her appointment. I track her on Life 360, so she's safe. But I think what's really important now, as I mentioned, we're going to walk you through the problem. We're going to walk you through the solutions. And you've heard them, treatment solutions and care solutions and diagnostic solutions. That gives us the hope. But now we're going to talk about how do we actually get those to the bedside. And what are the barriers then on our way of doing that. So I would like to bring up our next panel, John and Brandy and Laura and Lori and Jeff. Come on up. And I know you guys are going to love hearing from this group because they're going to bring it home. They're going to talk about not just what's happened on the research side, but how close we are to really making a difference. Hi. In patient care. Okay. We're a little snuggy up here. Okay. So you guys have met John. We've introduced John. My dear friend, Dr. Brandy Matthews from Eli Lilly and Company. Laura Parnas is here from Roche. And Lori Gutman, who was part of the program that you heard earlier happening at IU as well. And Jeff's already had a referral from the stage, Jeff Daig, who is recovering Lilly now at IU. You might hear a bit of that today. So actually, I want to start with Jeff and Laura because I'm going to jump off a request that Jared made earlier, which was around tools and blood biomarkers. And Jeff, you're here in Indiana, you're a world-renowned expert. So talk to us about what's going on in the field of blood biomarkers, a little bit for the group, and how you think this might work from research to patient care.
Yeah, well, that could take forever.
Yeah, you don't have forever.
Okay, so I'll go fast. So there's been incredible breakthroughs. So in blood biomarker world, 5 years ago, everyone thought it was impossible. We quickly discovered that we could measure some proteins in your blood that would correlate with the pathologies going on in the brain. But now we've really stepped beyond just the amyloid and tau, which we can do now, which is super exciting. And we can measure other things like the markers of astrocytosis or just general neurodegeneration. And all of these things together can really help us put a picture together of what's going on, and it can help in differential diagnosis. But that's all in research and in clinical research. We really have to advance this into patient care. And to do that, we have to do clinical research, and we have to understand how do we interpret these results, and how do we communicate that to the patient? How are these results returned? And that's really hard when it's really complicated and brand new and nobody believes it. So we're doing a lot of those kinds of work to educate people, to really build models to understand how they work and what they tell you and what they don't tell you and what it means and what are the risks of a false positive test and a false negative test, and how do you recognize that? And then in these diseases of aging, like Alzheimer's disease, all the comorbidities that come along with it. As we age, we build up diseases. And how do all of these things contribute to confound our measures? We have to understand all this, and it's all done through clinical research. It's one of the reasons I left Lilly and came to IU, because I want to do it. I want to make these blood tests available to everybody around the world. It's about accessibility. The blood tests now, we're working in space where you can do a finger prick and put it on a blood card and mail it in, right? That's the future. So do you have to go to the lab? No. In the future, you're going to be able to do it at home. It'll be just like testing your blood sugar. And so that's where we're going, and I think that's what the future holds.
Yeah, I think, for someone who has a lot of experience in drug development, not gonna lie, diagnostics is like the wild, wild west. And things have been moving at a very, very rapid clip. And Laura, obviously your company is in the expertise of blood biomarkers. So we want you to talk a little bit about what Roche is doing, but before you do that, can you explain to this group just some of the categories of blood tests? So lab developed test, IVD at a very high level, and once again, fairly quickly. But I think it's really critical because things can happen in the diagnostic space that are very different from the therapeutic space, right? You won't see a therapeutic company talking about their drug and saying this can be DTC, right? But some of those regulatory things are a little bit different in the diagnostic space. So I think this group, it would be helpful for them to be grounded a little bit, and then you can talk about Roche's approach to that regulatory.
Absolutely. And as a recovering clinical laboratory scientist, I am super excited about talking about biomarkers, right? Usually the lab is in the basement of the hospital. But anyway, there's several different categories for the regulatory levels from the biomarkers that are available. And for us as Roche to bring the biomarkers to the market, we go through a very thorough process from discovery through feasibility, technical feasibility, right? We need to be able to deploy this all over the world where our instruments are, all over the world in laboratories. And then we go through a very rigorous process to make them what we call IVD grade or in vitro diagnostics grade. And that requires a lot of studies and just not only demonstrated that they're good biomarkers, but also that they're very accurate, reproducible, and then they can be done anywhere, high altitude, low altitude, by any person that shows up and is doing this testing. And then we go through what is the intended use for that particular population, right? So that's very, very important part of the in vitro diagnostics development. So, and then we actually submit our information to the FDA. The FDA does their review. We do have, obviously, a process for dialogue with the FDA. We don't go blind to them. So there's quite a bit of dialogue before we do a submission. And then at the end of it, we get an approval. In the United States, this is very specific for the United States. There is some flexibility in the clinical lab industry where they can, the clinical lab has the ability of introduce a test that is deemed for research use only, and they are able to do the studies themselves. They are not as extensive as what we do as a manufacturer because they are going to use it only in their laboratory, and then they are able to offer it clinically as a laboratory developed test. So this is something that laboratorians have the ability to do. The medical directors, the pathologists are in their laboratories. They have the legal authority to verify the performance in their laboratory and then offer them commercially as a laboratory developed test. This is a very controversial topic right now because there is somewhat of a gray area where the FDA is having some intentions of stepping in there.
So I'm just going to pause on that. So in case you hear this, laboratory developed test is LDT. Okay, so sorry, keep going. Yes. Glossary of terms.
Yep, so I think that's kind of where we are. There's things that are tests that are only for research use. They could not be used in patients. Then some of those research use only RUOs are developed in one particular laboratory as a laboratory developed test. They're able to offer it for clinical use. And then there's a third category, the FDA approved. They go through the whole IVD process with a clinical trial and demonstrated accuracy and precision for the intended use population.
And that is an IVD.
IVD.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us real quick where Roche is in their process on that, where you are in that spectrum?
Yep. So for us, we have at this time since Dr. Lam did a great introduction on the on the pathology of Alzheimer's. We have FDA-approved assays for CSF for spinal fluid that detect both amyloid plaques and tangle, the hallmarks in the CSF. And then we are working actively right now with the FDA on our blood-based biomarker. So we are conducting a prospective clinical trial that is actually ongoing and recruiting right now all over the country. John is very familiar with that, the clinical trial as well. And then IU too is one of our sites. So we are in the process of collecting that information for that intended use population. We want to make sure that the population that will receive this test is everybody who comes to the primary care. So not only those patients with symptoms, but kind of what Jared was talking about earlier, where sometimes you don't have symptoms and you're still at risk. So those patients are also part of this large clinical trial, and then we're going to submit that information once the trial is done to the FDA.
Thank you for educating us. A couple of other key pieces that you probably heard is both clinical validation, but also analytical validation. So how do we avoid, I guess, Theranos, right? So anyway, which as soon as you say a blood prick, my eye starts twitching, but my finger prick. But this is really important. The first blood test in the United States that was approved was actually a kind of technology called mass spec, which doesn't scale very well. So, and I know this because I've been shipping blood tests from Brazil to St. Louis. Interestingly, our only batch that didn't make it was from Indiana, which was only 4 hours away. So we were able to get it there from Brazil on dry ice, but not from Indiana. But that obviously is an operational hurdle. So the other thing that you're going to hear about is how do you do these tests analytically validated on these high throughput machines that can then be spread out and done in hospitals or laboratory settings, Quests, things like that, LabCorp, those kinds of those organizations that you've heard of when you went to get your HbA1c. How do you do that on that high throughput? So for those of you that are thinking about things like real estate, because I know there's some folks think about that. So before we go to our clinicians, I want to make one more stop on the research side as it relates to biomarkers. So John mentioned earlier that he leads the Global Alzheimer's Platform. He's looking at how do you make clinical trials better, cheaper, faster. And then COVID hit. And he had a whole bunch of sites that couldn't get patients in, and a whole bunch of sponsored studies that kind of slowed down. And he came up with this really interesting study that's recently finished called BioHermes that actually looks at biomarkers. So why don't you tell the story a little bit about BioHermes and what data is coming out right now?
Thank you, and I just object because I often play a neurologist on TV. So, so it's 2020, and we have been able to assemble an affiliated set of sites, about 100, including IU, one of our premier sites, to conduct clinical trials. But COVID hits, and I'll use Georgetown. To get to the neurology clinical trial part of Georgetown, you go right through pulmonology, right smack through it. And during COVID, that was a bad thing because you weren't going to want to go into a clinical trial as you watched, green bottle after green bottle person getting their oxygen waiting in the waiting room. So they had to shut down. Everybody had to shut down to some extent. But we also knew from the studies we've been in Lilly's studies, and we've been in ASI's and Biogen. In fact, we've been in all the approved studies, so maybe there's a reason to hire us because we get the drug approved. Maybe not. That's the issue of statistics. But in the course of that, we knew we needed a lot more data to redesign clinical trials. So we used the hiatus to our advantage to do two things. The first was, as Jeff has already started to allude to, we took and created a study that took every available blood marker that we could get to play with us and a whole bunch of the digital cognitive tests. And we put them in a study of 1,001. We ended up recruiting 1,001 people, 3 cohorts, asymptomatic, MCI, mild AD. And the goal was, let's some of you remember Consumer Reports. I wanted to do a side-by-side. I wanted to see I'm an entrepreneur. I wanted to see what all these entrepreneurial companies were really talking about and start to sort the wheat from the chaff. Now, commercially, that might not be your first instinct, is to come into a side-by-side study. So as they say in the MBA school over there at Indiana University, why did they do that? Because they can't get that data by themselves. Big Pharma is not going to let diagnostics pay for that study, and the entrepreneurial small commercials can't either. So we use that in a proper way to induce all these people to come into the study. Now, we didn't do it with NIA money for basically speed. So we crowdsourced it if you're under 40, or we syndicated it if you're over 40. But, and it was a $20 million study. We got it done in 18 months. The second thing we did, and this is where my team often regrets that I go to the beach. I was sitting in the beach, and I had one of those chairs they give you where you can put cold libations, and I may have had a couple of those. And I made a determination that we were going to do something else different, which was we were going to keep the study open until it was at least 20% populated by folks of underrepresented populations. We were not going to replicate the model of preceding studies because we knew we needed to know how do these things work in everybody. And so we ended up at 24%. But it takes a certain sense of, thank you.
By the way, that's a huge deal. I think the highest studies that are out there right now, Brandy probably knows this number, are in more like the single digit numbers. So to come up with a 24% people that are of color underrepresented, possibly because it was a biomarker study.
I just wanted to say that.
Which I think is really helpful. But still, we had it. We had it. Sorry.
Well, I mean, Phyllis is absolutely right. It's a whole order of magnitude easier to recruit for a biomarker study than it is for a therapeutic study. So I say that number with great humility, but boy, does it teach you a lot. Boy, does it teach you a lot to say, I don't quit till I hit that number. How am I going to organize ourselves to do that? So we did one thing. You might have even seen it on the Today program. We started a site in Starr County, Texas, de novo. Found a partner, opened it up. It is literally 1.5 miles from the Rio Grande Valley border with Mexico. And our PI has been there for his family's been there for 200 years. And if you recruit anything other than a Mexican American, you look for a recount because it's 98% Mexican Americans. That helped with our Hispanic, Latino recruitment. What did we learn? Before I get to the biomarkers part, I do want to stress, we learned a lot about what is different when you really go to the areas that want to be involved in studies that are not routinely penetrated by studies. Number one, the digital cognitive tests we all use, we were seeing people with less than 6 years of formal education. And these digital cognitive tests aren't validated for people with less than 6 years of education. We're going, holy cow. Well, we, of course, enrolled them, but then we had to figure out how we were going to do that. Yeah, but on the biomarker side, and I'll talk more about that later, is we learned a lot that Jeff Dage partially inspired, but the goal was create this big, we have over 1 terabyte of data now. We slammed in genetics and proteomics, and now we're in there interrogating it to say, what are the signals across all these different markers for the purpose of asking what will work better? And next time you come around to me, I'll give you the results.
Holding me out. Okay, I've got two physicians on here, so Lori and Brandy, I'm going to come to you both. We'll start with you, Lori, on how do you actually get these tests now? I mean, Laura just gave us some education. Our experience is a lot of our physicians don't know all these things about the blood test process, regulatory process, let alone about amyloid. So how do you think about how I'm going to transform my clinical practice to make sure that these tests get used?
Well, that's a hard question because, I mean, you're talking about an operational approach, right? And you're also talking about an educational approach. So one is with any and maybe I'm not answering exactly what you're asking, but with any new available test, part of what you have to do is educate the people who are seeing these patients. And it may not be neurologists. I mean, I think I missed the morning because I was in clinic actually, but I know that you guys talked about a little bit about, you know, some of the efforts to get primary care physicians to be thinking about this, and programs where maybe once you turn 65, you just go ahead and start testing for things, even before people show evidence of any kind of decline. So, so one is educating the people so that they know where it is or know that it's available and who to test. But the other operational thing is, and maybe this isn't what you're asking me, but it gets really difficult because you have to get it into, now we have electronic health records, right? You have to get it into the electronic health record in a way that people can easily find it and order it, and then the results come back. You have to, that's the other part of the education, you have to know what to do when you get the results back.
I think the operational things are really relevant for this crew, right? Because we've been talking about where are there opportunities to take the Legos apart and put them back together in a way. So let's talk a little bit about that medical record. So you guys did use, for a little while, the blood test as part of the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. I'm not sure if I know the answer to this. Jared might know this. How long was your turnaround time from when the blood test was sent and it got back?
I honestly don't know that because I wasn't part of it, and Jared had to go.
Let me ask you this. I know you'd like instantaneous turnaround, right? But what would be acceptable to you in terms of the turnaround time from when someone gets a blood test and then the results are back?
I mean, if I think about, you know, compare it to like hereditary disorders and you're getting a gene testing, right? You don't want it to be more than 1 to 2 weeks, really, because what happens as a patient, we all know, right? You get this blood test and then you just sit there and you're like, well, it might be negative, but it could be positive, but it might, and what am I gonna do? And you're just, it's terrible for the person who had the test done to them, waiting that long period of time. So instantaneous.
You have to mail it in. Yeah.
Well, that's where these high throughput machines become important, right? Because if you're doing the test there,
I don't want to go down the Theranos route though, because I know that's, yeah. So, but since you mentioned it earlier, but I mean, the other thing is,
you also want it to be accurate,
and
right?
you want
Timely and accurate.
Right. And sometimes, I mean, actually to go back to some of the testing, I mean, sometimes what you do with all of these different tests is you do, you know, a highly sensitive, maybe not so specific test so that you can actually then say, okay, now we're gonna, so I can give you this answer right away that it, you know, it doesn't look like this is the problem, but if it's a positive, then now I'm gonna do this more specific, right? And that's actually another pathway for thinking.
So that's another good scientific point, is the value of a negative, high negative predictive value versus positive, which is a little bit harder to get and could pass you to another test. So Brandy, you don't have operational responsibility like Lori does, but you've got, you know, a globe that you're looking at. So let's talk about the U.S. What do you see as those big operational and educational barriers to this timely and accurate diagnosis?
I mean, I guess on the operational side, I'll take a little off-ramp to discuss access and reimbursement. Because although I'm not a policy expert, I'm trained as a dementia specialist, I see this access and reimbursement as one of the major barriers to translating science into clinical practice. So I have some thoughts about it. And it bridges across both diagnostics and therapeutics. And so maybe I'll take the opportunity to discuss both. One is that we've had a little bit of hope recently as the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Oh, you're on now.
Okay. Have retired a national coverage determination with associated coverage with evidence development in the space of amyloid PET scans that Bruce mentioned earlier today as a an opportunity to diagnose Alzheimer's disease pathology during life. And so this retirement of the national coverage determination in October is an acknowledgement by the agency that there's value in an accurate diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and this is a huge step forward for the field. So that's on the side.
I may have to stand behind you and you can talk into my collar.
Yeah, I don't. So on the contrary, there is now in place a national coverage determination with associated coverage with evidence development for therapeutics, amyloid targeting therapies with the potential to modify the course of disease. And this adds administrative burden for both providers and for patients. It introduces ambiguity and uncertainty in the field of innovation to develop new therapies. And so the consequence is that we all are going to have to come together as academics, as industry, as government, as advocates to say, this is important that we have equitable access to both diagnostics and therapeutics in order to ensure that we are advancing this amazing science into clinical practice.
I was at the Danaher Summit yesterday in Washington, D.C., and the keynote speaker said that the majority of diagnostics don't fail because of the science. They fail because of access. So I'm going to bounce right back to Lori because we were talking about blood. I love that Brandy took us a step forward. Walk us through what that treatment path looks like for you now. I mean, you're obviously a practicing neurologist. You guys have the brain health. But walk us through everything from that, you've got someone who ends up in a neurology office with cognitive impairment. Just walk the group through what that looks like, what their journey is for you.
Right. So,
and how it might change.
Yeah, so we are actually, it is changing even as we speak. We have, so we learned a lot actually from being a part of the DAC project, right? Because looking at how can we streamline a patient's pathway, because that project looked at can you diagnose people early before they have significant symptoms, right? How the earlier we get to people, the better, right? But then the question is, okay, so then what, right? And can we, with the number, there's always a shortage of neurologists. As my whole multiple decade career, there's always been a shortage. But so how do you get people to the right place at the right time? And if they don't go one place, you don't want them to feel like, sorry, you don't qualify for this, so
good luck
later. Yeah. So part of what we've done at IU Health and with the work of Donna Wilcock and Liana Apostolova and Jared Brosh has been a big part of that. Dustin Hammer, some of the people that you've heard from already today, was to set up a program that using what we call a brain health navigator. So if someone thinks that they have been, they have some type of test that takes them to the next step, they talk to the brain health navigator, they figure out what tests do they need and in what order to move them on to, you can get this disease modifying therapy, this isn't the right thing for you, you need this other test, or here's how we can support you. So we actually started with one brain health navigator, and I'm talking just about our experience, and we are just hiring our second one. We've just hired our second one because we just really need that flow. And then you can, rather than having people screened by a neurologist, wait 6 months to get an appointment with a neurologist, here you can just get plugged right in and then prioritized based on where you are with the disease or where you are with your testing to the next step. And I think that those are the kind of really incredibly thoughtful operational approaches that we need. The problem is, to go back to what Brandy said, is the barriers that are there. We can try to break down those barriers as much as we can up front in the clinical space, but there's still the barriers of prior authorizations or getting the patients to us. So using some of this can be done by virtual visits, some of it cannot be. So how do you get the patients to the place where they're going to get diagnosed? Who's going to pay for the testing, right? All those kind of things. And then you qualify for the medication, and then you start it all, a medication or some approach, and you start all over again with prior authorization and then finding a place where the patient can get to get some type of therapy. So, but I do think that, we've really we put a whole team together. I mean, it took the health system saying, okay, these are our people, right? And we have the whole state to think about. And I was just at the Indiana Neurological Society meeting last week, and people were saying, we're so glad that you guys are taking the lead in this, and can we send you our patients? We're like, okay, well, we're still working through the process, and we're going to set it up so that it can be done, so patients don't all have to come to Indianapolis. We're going to be helping across the state, beyond just IU Health, I think. Obviously.
Yeah, the Brain Health Navigator came out of the idea came from the IU team as part of that Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative project, and the grant funded it. Have you guys figured out a way to get those Brain Health Navigators funded?
So the health system is
covering it?
Well, it's through the Neuroscience Institute. So it helps that Bruce and I are co-directors with Mitesh Shah of the Neuroscience Institute, and we have some money. And so we said, this is key for this particular initiative.
Great.
So I just want to pause for a minute. We've been having a conversation about why Indiana can do this. And you're hearing it right now. We've done these programs now as part of the DAC project across multiple different states and countries. And what we've found is the research silo doesn't often talk with the healthcare silo. And in fact, sometimes there's a third: research, the medical school, and the health system. And there was a time when we started this project where I remember calling Jeff going, hey, Jeff, do you know Lori? Bruce, do you know Jared? Would you guys go talk to each other? And the beauty was you did know each other, and you did circle up together, and you did figure out. And there were actually times where we struggled with some health system things. And, Bruce would step in, obviously not a member of the health system, to make sure that all of that academic research knowledge was shared. So let me just put a pin in that, because I'm here to tell you that that's something that's very unique and different about Indiana. We do not see that lack of internal politics and lack of territory, a kind of a focus on the patient. Now you have a situation here where you've got an institute actually paying for a health system resource. We have to find a way to get those Brain Health Navigators paid for by Medicare.
I will say the health system does help supply some of the funds to the institute.
Good.
I don't want you. They have been listening to us. We've gone. I'm fortunate to be surrounded by people who are well spoken and can explain the importance of what we're trying to do. And it really is, beyond just our health system. If we can build it, others can.
So I'm going to come to Laura and then Brandy, because you guys have assets that are in this patient journey, right? So you have someone that's cognitively impaired. So we're not talking about the asymptomatic population right now. We are talking about someone who has cognitive impairment. They have to potentially get a blood test, potentially get a PET or CSF test before they get a therapy. So Laura, what are you guys doing to make sure that those blood tests are available, and what do you need help from this group to do that?
It's a great question. I mean, from a CSF perspective, I think we're already there. And I'm going to build a little bit of what Brandy was saying about the access and reimbursement. I think that's what we're hearing right now from people who are using the tests are those barriers. And rest assured, our teams are working very hard, but there are still some barriers in terms of how these tests are reimbursed. And then for the plasma tests, I think we think that there's still more work to do to find to really make sure that those tests are accurate, and then they are as accurate as possible, so the intended use population is benefited the most. But I kind of agree with the rule out that you talked about, Lori, in terms of we have a big funnel of potential patients out there, right? That if with an easy and accessible and cheap blood test that nobody cares about a phlebotomy anymore, then we can say all of these patients do not have a risk of developing Alzheimer's, and we can focus on this other part of the funnel. So I think that's really, really important.
Or as Maria said earlier, we know enough information that they don't have to be tested again for a period amount of time.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. And then again, we get tested for cholesterol, TSH pretty much right every year, or when we have our yearly visits. So I think that's the holy grail will be that situation. And obviously the bigger holy grail will be to be able to diagnose with a simple blood test. We're not there yet, but we're moving very fast. So I think I'm very encouraged by this group of individuals here, especially in Indiana, where a lot of brain power is being dedicated to Alzheimer's disease and advancing that.
Yeah, thank you. Brandy, before we come to you, I have to ask Jeff this question. What's your projection on, I'm not going to ask you how long it's going to take to get blood tests into clinical practice, because sadly the research says it's 17 to 20 years before innovation gets into clinical practice, and that cannot be the case. But how long before the blood test becomes a definitive diagnosis? I mean, this science is moving as fast as possible. We know it's a gatekeeping mechanism now to later stage, whether that be lumbar puncture, CSF, or PET. But how long do you think before it's really definitive?
Yeah, I think it'll take time to build up the body of evidence, because I think really that's what it is. It's about building that confidence in what it means and what it doesn't mean, and how do you act on it. And then even as you alluded to, how often do you need to get measured? So if you are negative, are you going to be negative next year? And if you're positive, do you want to get tested again in 6 months to make sure you stay positive? You know, maybe that's another way just to think about it. But then, you know, we have to have these data sets that are, you know, hundreds of thousands of people, right? That takes a long time unless we have a concerted effort to do it. And I think that's where things are going with these patient management systems and trying to collect data on everybody being treated. Well, that creates an opportunity for a really large research biobank, which I love. And so I think those kinds of things, the faster we can get that data, the better. The more representative of the population, the better. You know, exactly how long, you know, I don't know. I think it takes.
And also standardization across the tests, right?
Yeah,
so that you know how to compare between them.
Yeah, that took CSF. It took years, right? And
how long did it take for HbA1c, I wonder?
Oh yeah, I don't know.
Years?
Years.
So,
Yeah.
Some things have never been done, and so there's. I mean, it's always nice to have it, and it's important because then it allows you to compare numbers from one place to another. But it's not always required. And so, you know, I'm all for moving really fast and then fixing it at the end. And
Me
so,
too.
Unless you're giving the patients the wrong diagnosis.
well, I mean, I'm all about accuracy. Anybody who knows me knows I expect really, really super high quality and high accuracy, and really understanding what that result means. And that's the hardest part, is because if you get what appears to be a false positive, you have to understand what drove it. And there's a lot of things that we would want to know as far as their health, patient's health, is what drove it. So I think we have to generate that body of evidence. There's a lot, like right now at Indiana, in the National Centralized Repository for Alzheimer's Disease and Related Dementias, we have a biomarker lab where we run 3,000 to 4,000 samples from the Alzheimer's disease centers around the country every year. So already I think we're up to over 3,000. By next year we'll have 6,000, 7,000. And so you see this, it's not going to be, that's just one site, one lab that I just set up just after I left Lilly. So it doesn't take that long to have that body of evidence generated. And then it's going to be about, like, we ran it all on one platform, and now there's a new one. We need to do the Roche test. Now we need to do this other test. And then we have to do what John said and compare them all. And then we have
Make
to
sure you
decide.
have diverse population,
Yeah,
all the cutoffs are right, and yeah.
Then we decide if we want to standardize them.
I think this is important because to some degree, the speed of the science is a really good thing, right? But to some degree, the speed of the science also paralyzes the general practitioner.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because you don't have concrete information, and they go, I'll wait until you guys get this figured out. So, Brandy, as I listen to this, is it an absolute miracle if someone actually gets one of these drugs? I mean, it's scary to think about all the steps that have to happen to make sure that the right person gets the right drug at the right time.
Well, I certainly hope it doesn't require a miracle, both as a clinician and as someone who's invested my entire career in, like, getting these things across the finish line. But I would say that also I have a bias as a clinician educator in that I think we can probably contract the runway with a really strong focus on education and education across the continuum of providers. So we've heard about primary care clinicians, we've heard about some specialists, neurologists, geriatricians, even radiologists in the context of these new therapies, but also educating patients so that they're confident to raise their hand and say something's not right, but also confident to communicate their treatment goals. So it's a really heavy lift in the space of education. But again, I think this collaboration across stakeholders could really move the needle and move us toward getting the appropriate patient on the appropriate therapy. I also think we probably need a kind of seismic shift in the culture as it relates to prioritizing brain health and destigmatizing brain disease.
Absolutely.
So these are like the bookends to this effort in education that's going to go across the continuum of providers to patients. But I'm really encouraged by all the people in this room representing different sectors to say that we might be able to do this seismic shift in the culture and say, like, the health of our brains, that's our priority. We're going to talk about that. We're going to do something about it. And then on the corollary to say, it's not the A word. Alzheimer's disease, it's a medical condition that we can diagnose accurately and we can treat effectively. So I'm looking forward to this not miracle of treating patients with medicines that can modify the disease course.
Well, and once again, operational challenges, right? I mean, shame on us if we make all this progress scientifically and we can't tackle the operational ones. John, you got a big head nod on the changing the mindset of brain health. Did you have trouble? I mean, when you were enrolling that BioHermes study, I mean, you guys did a ton of outreach. So I know you're going to keep us on pins and needles for the results, and hopefully you'll give us that too in this answer. But about brain health, I mean, people, do they want to talk about their brain health, and what does that look like?
So I'll answer your question directly. One of the things that we learned when we rolled out BioHermes, we might have even known it a little earlier, comes from a wonderful practicing physician in Kansas City, Missouri. And he runs the
Also
Black
named Jeff.
No, actually.
Oh, not Jeff?
Actually, Dr. Faulkner, and he runs the Black Healthcare Coalition, which the Jeff you're referring to could not have done. And he said to me when I first met him, "You're a suit. Come in here, you want a favor, you want me to send people to your studies, and then you're gone until you come back again for another study." Well, we learned really early on that cadence and participation in the community when you don't need anything is critical to then creating that relationship where they want to believe in what you are trying to get them to do after you have helped them do what they wanted to do. So, one lesson learned. Back to the actual study. First, this is a rhetorical question. Is the Department of Ophthalmology in this conference? Because I'm going to tell you, while he's the greatest
Get that,
biomarker,
Jane? The Department of Ophthalmology.
while he's the greatest biomarker guy in the world, we really are highly indexed on the ability to look at the retinal nerve and learn some things, some really important things. And to your earlier point, how long does it take for you to put your eyes into what you often do in an ophthalmology visit, get a picture of that thing taken, somebody runs some AI and kicks it back to you? I'm all about point of care. And I want the process to have the shortest timelines from the time they hit the front door to, and so we're going to use this in clinical trials. The other two outcomes I want to share with you very quickly is we got people recruited because our sites, the Indiana University of Cleveland is called Cleveland Clinic. And we have a site there, and they actually, when they enroll somebody, I would go and visit them, and they would say, the participants would say, "This is my spa day. I have such a great time here, and I learned so much, and it's a wonderful experience, and I love it here, and I look forward to coming here every month." That's how you do a clinical trial, what Russ was saying. is whatever your protocol is, if you're jamming them up with 15 cognitive tests, shame on you. And so we're all about giving an experience that's high quality. Our results were no different than what's been generally published, with one big message to all of us. There's a wonderful opportunity that our study shows, and we have a paper going out on it, so I won't say everything about it, but all the blood tests work if you're trying to solve for 25 centiloids. If you're
Centiloids is the equivalent PET. Keep going.
a level of beta amyloid, and that is clinically appropriate. I want Maria to hear me say that on the record, okay? That is clinically appropriate. But our data show that a disproportionate number of African Americans don't hit that cutoff on these blood tests and in the PET. We were in the first symposium with CTAD with our data showing that literally comparably situated white Americans and black Americans were presenting, and if we didn't have the blood test or the PET image, a practicing physician 10 years ago would say, I think you may have Alzheimer's. Now you're not going to be able to say that. You're going to have to say something else. However, I think that I really believe this. I want to leave on an optimistic note. One of my smartest friends in the world is an architect who says, John, always look in the negative space. These screen fails are going to be such a rich place for us to figure out what the hell is going on. Because if you get that screen, those people figured out, and we are very committed to that, we're going to learn a lot more about the causal effects of the disease with a precision. We need more markers, use an algorithm, big AI. There are a bunch of kids, young people, and masters out there somewhere that were talking to me. Grind the data and look for the pattern that you've never seen before. And we're going to be able to treat patients better. 5 companies are going into the FDA to get a blood test approved as an IVD. 5. That is great news.
Unbelievable.
Because some of those are going to get an approval quicker.
Hopefully all of them.
Yes, but it'll happen quickly.
Yeah, it's amazing how much progress we've had in 10 years ago, people were like, blood test was never going to happen. So thank you, Jeff, to you and your community, and John, to your research, Roche, for getting us there. So I'm going to give you guys each one last question, and you didn't get this in advance, so think fast. So we talked about 2 things today that we were going to sell to you. One is that we've made enough progress that it's time to be really, really hopeful. 2, that there are barriers to actually making sure that the innovation that's coming out of research can make a change at clinical practice. But that collaboration is the name of the game and the answer. And in fact, the hypothesis is Indiana can really do this. So this is going to be my question. You've got this group out here that's multi-sector. You get to ask them for one thing. What do you want to ask this group in that barriers to collaboration? There's somebody out here that's going to represent that sector for you. What do you want to ask? Your call to action. Jeff.
Gosh, I'm first. So I think for me, the science for me is solved. My biggest problem is convincing everybody else and teaching everybody else that it's solved and how to use stuff. So my ask is, no matter what area you are in and no matter what you're doing, help understand it, develop educational materials, talk to everybody you interact with, and teach them about what's coming and what's here and what's possible. And develop tools. And somebody else referenced TikTok. Make TikTok videos, I guess. I think whatever you can do to educate the world about where we are today and where we're going is what we need to do. And get involved in research.
Thanks. Lori?
So I would probably say the ask would be help with community engagement. And when I say community engagement, I'm not talking just about people who may have or develop this disorder. I'm talking about the whole community, including, the medical community, and kind of sort of what you were talking about is, the cross collaboration, but getting the medical community along with the community at risk on the same page. How do we do that to get people, we talked about it in this conference, I'm sure, I don't know how many times, but, the sooner we can get people to the treatments or to a diagnosis, the better all around, right? And that's a two-sided or maybe three-sided group. You're getting the medical community to think about it and to move it forward. Not necessarily the neurologists, the dementia experts, those people know that. It's the rest of the medical community that can then take the community at risk and bring them forward.
Okay. Laura?
Yeah, for me, it's really about amplifying the message. Maybe building on what you guys said is really talk with others, share what you've learned today from the whole spectrum, from patients to caregivers to the science to clinical practice, and continue to ask questions. I think for me is also the curiosity. Continue to ask questions and push the boundaries. We've been able to advance the field because we've been asking questions and demanding action and demanding blood tests and demanding therapies, and people have been creative. So continue doing that, and I think we will get there.
So I'm going to make two asks. One's a reflection of what's been stated already. That's raise your voice. And the second is, after consuming this information today or in reflection on how this is touching you personally, identify the role of your expertise in making this an easier journey for patients, for their loved ones, for the healthcare professionals, for the scientific community, because this is super complex, as you've heard today. And I believe that there's likely a role for everyone in breaking down some barriers in whatever their area of expertise may be. So I would just challenge you to carve out a few minutes and think about that. What's the application of the learnings from today in the world in which you work?
John?
My ask would be to reach into your entrepreneurial, creative self and consider how you go into the IU system, and when a loved one is having a neurology visit, that IU provides a way for the sibling, the children of that person and the grandchildren of that person can also get a cognitive baseline or a baseline in blood, so that we start building natural foundational longitudinal emphasis and make it cool to get a baseline as soon as possible. It's going to drive what Maria's doing at the association, what IU's doing, and we shouldn't make the first ask a 2-year process. Something simple and build on it.
I love it. Let's make knowing your brain health cool. So can I get a big thank you for this wonderful panel? If you guys will sit here for just 1 second, just a couple of things. We asked that we were going to celebrate hope. So hopefully we were successful in that today. Is that correct? Yes? Yes, okay. We talked about barriers and the fact that multi-sector collaboration is going to be the path through them. Were we successful there? Figured out what your role is? We've talked about Indiana being the place that can do this. How about that? Can I get a whoop whoop? Okay. Somebody can sing the Indiana fight song here in just a second, the IU fight song. The other thing that we did was we said we have to change the mindset. You've heard this several times. If Darlene did not change the mindset for you on what Alzheimer's looks like, you've been asleep. We have had a late mindset for this disease, and it has to change. And so we all have a role to play. Indiana can do this for Darlene, for Bruce, for my daddy, for Kim's mama, for whoever you thought of when you raised your hand first thing this morning. Thank you.